Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, in 2001, turn of the century, census showed that around about 71% of people in this country identified as Christian. But by 2021, that had dropped to something like 47%, a precipitous decline. I think you'll agree. The reasons for that and why it matters is actually the subject of this book, The Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters. I'm very pleased that we're actually joined by the author of this book, Rupert Shortt. Thank you very much for coming, Rupert.
Thank you.
That's a huge drop. I mean, in a nutshell, if you possibly can, what happened?
Well, it's very difficult to say in a nutshell because I think the problems have deep historical roots. They're not just related to the past generation. What isn't in any doubt, I don't think, is that in Europe, at any rate, secularization is advancing very rapidly, even as in the world as a whole, we're witnessing, if anything, quite a strong return to religion.
Yes. Yeah. Well, in fact, actually, in the wider world, in Africa, and I think it's with Christianity in Africa, Pentecostalism in the East, huge, expansion.
Enormous, yes, and the irony is that democratization, modernization, globalization, far from making God weaker, have made God stronger. 3 or 4 generations ago, I think you had a generation of secular elites in societies ranging from Egypt to Turkey to India, Indonesia, Mexico, who simply thought that religion was a bit childish and that it would fade away inevitably. And what's happened? Well, it's come back to bite them in the form of fundamentalism in many societies. But I'm glad that you've mentioned Pentecostalism, because that is the Christian counterpart to Islamic revivalism. It is, however, resolutely non-violent. And because of this narrative that you have in Western journalism, that religion is A, dead in the West, and B, violent in the East, it doesn't get anything like the attention I think that it deserves. If you just bracket for a moment the question of how sophisticated the theology is, and of course it may not be all that sophisticated in many cases, it is nevertheless an enormous source of social capital. I think what you find today honeycombing around the edge of the global megacity in thousands upon thousands of small communities, many of them led by women, very poor people getting their lives on track, men forsaking the bottle and promiscuity and all sorts of other positive changes. So my book does pivot on a paradox, if you like, because none of what I have just said is to detract from the fact that in Britain and the rest of Western Europe, we are plainly witnessing very, very sharp decline.
Yes. I mean, I was being slightly facetious when I said in a nutshell earlier, because of course that's the whole point of your book. But why so fast in the past 20 years in this country, such a decline in people even saying that they identify as Christian, and of course a rise in people saying they have no religion whatsoever? Why? What do you think accounts for that?
Well, one way of looking at it might be to talk about the new gospel of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
And I wouldn't be the first observer to say that in some ways we're witnessing a dynamic not unlike that of late 4th, early 5th century Rome, where you have an exhausted paganism, a new kid on the block in the form of a tremendously self-confident Christianity. And you could argue that 1,500, 1,600 years on, we're witnessing the same thing in reverse. So there's been a retreat of church leaders from the public square, and into the vacuum has been placed, has arisen this, as I say, very, very self-confident set of doctrines, which seems to be particularly appealing to young people, and in some ways fits very well in a more multicultural society. Part of my object in this book is to argue that we might be safer with the older wisdom than the newer one. But I think that's part of the story. And of course, with multiculturalism, you have what that term coined by the late Roger Scruton, oikophobia. That's to say the opposite of xenophobia, a reluctance to affirm our own roots and our own identity.
Well, a rejection.
Yes, in the interests of not offending others.
Yes, I mean, it goes to the root of, so we were discussing this before we came on, actually, amongst us here. There is this sort of this kind of self-loathing and rejection is at the basis of so many of our problems, I would say. You mentioned there that this was a kind of reverse situation, so like paganism was on the kind of rise. But what about Islam? Because one thing that we have seen during that time is an incredibly resurgent and confident Islam and a greater presence of it in Western countries. I mean, surely that must have had a kind of effect.
Yes, absolutely. In positive and perhaps more questionable ways. I mean, if I were to strike an ironic note, I would say that some of the people who are most in favour of having bishops in the House of Lords in this country are some of my Muslim friends. They like the idea of bishops standing up for faith, standing up for the spiritual dimension in general. On the other hand, I wouldn't also be the first person to notice a peculiar alliance between the woke left and the forces of more carnivorous Islamism. Christianity and Islam are the two most potent worldviews in existence, and both are growing strongly. If the 20th century was about clashes of ideology, I think that there's a very good case for arguing that the 21st, as well as being about relations between the West and China, will be about the capacity of Christians and Muslims to get on well with each other. And that will present many challenges, I think, as well as opportunities.
What is the record of them getting on well together? I mean, when you look at, for example, the Middle East, where Christianity is basically being banished, more or less. I don't know. The way I look at Rupert, I'm talking about Britain, and I'm talking about the past 20 years, is it seems to me that this kind of sudden rise in atheism amongst many people was almost a strange response to the rise of Islam in the West, in the sense that it was sort of, well, it's all bad. It's all bad. So let's stop believing in any of it. And to me, that completely misreads the situation. Would you agree with that?
I see where you're coming from. When you say, what are the examples of coexistence? I mean, I would say as a Christian that historically Muslim societies have been better than Christian ones at absorbing minorities, or at any rate, never never as bad as Christian societies at their worst. I mean, there's never been anything like the Holocaust in a traditionally Muslim society. But on the other hand, never as good as Christian societies at their best. And of course, there's been a lot of repentance and change and improvement in the Christian world.
But wait a minute, the Holocaust, you mean, you said the Holocaust?
Yes.
But the Holocaust wasn't actually a religious sort of question of religion, actually, was it? I mean, but not in the sense in which we're talking.
Yes, but Jews were expelled from traditionally Christian countries, whereas Jews and Christians were allowed, for example, to reside in the Ottoman Empire. Never on terms of complete equality with Muslims, but nevertheless as accepted members of society. The problem we face at the moment is really to do with the growth of Saudi Arabia in importance and influence and its ability to export one particular very hard line expression of Islamic fundamentalism. For centuries, that's right, for centuries Saudi Arabia was a backwater. It suddenly found itself in a position to be much more influential. And what's missing, I think, here is what's been described as the Balkans to Bengal strand of Islam, which is historically much more laid back, much more intellectually curious. If you look at societies including Persia, there's a tradition of erotic poetry there, including homoerotic poetry. Shiraz is a Persian word. It's where that kind of wine was produced. And of course, you've also got Sufism. And my heart goes out to Muslim friends who can feel tarred with a particular kind of brush. It's a little bit like the way that Richard Dawkins, in his anti-Christian polemics, always takes as an example the most stiff-necked kind of Christian fundamentalist from the Deep South, completely overlooking the fact that the figures who created the modern world, Galileo, Descartes, Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, Leibniz, going on to James Clerk Maxwell and Faraday, these were not just men of scientific genius. They were men of deep Christian conviction. I mean, somebody like Newton was even more interested in theology than in science. You implied a few minutes ago, you spoke of the way that Christianity can be a sort of bulwark against Islamic and other kinds of fundamentalism. And I see where you're coming from there. But on the other hand, I would be a little bit uneasy about some expressions of Christianity that you find in Europe that are very much connected, I think, with anti-immigrant rhetoric and a certain chauvinism. One of the things that saddens me about the contemporary UK is that I feel that we should be prouder of our record than we are. I mean, prouder of our record than we are. This is quite possibly the most successful multicultural society on earth at the moment. But as you indicated a few minutes ago, healthy self-criticism, which I regard as a good thing, has morphed in some quarters into self-laceration, which is a more questionable thing, and self-laceration into self-hatred, which I would definitely regard as a dangerous thing.
Yes. I suppose that, what I'm getting at in a way is, of course, that what we've seen in those 20 years is a huge demographic change, which is going to accelerate. And it has the wind in its sails because it is full of a very confident religion, and one that really, Islam, which really believes in itself. What I mean is that when the people in that, if you like, for want of a better expression, host society, when they no longer believe, then there is no defence to a complete and utter change in that society. I mean, it seems to me that demographically that sort of is undeniable. That is what is happening.
I think there is a great deal of truth in what you say. I would just qualify it by emphasising the importance of Christian immigration as well.
Yes.
London has become a much, much godlier place since the turn of the millennium. There are more African Pentecostals in southeast London than anywhere else on earth outside Africa. I have worked for Times newspapers for most of my career, and for a good number of years was based in the news building at London Bridge.
You were actually religion editor at the Times Literary Supplement.
That's right, for a long time. And talking to the staff, the catering staff, the cleaners, the people who made the building run every day was very instructive in terms of what it revealed about the ecosystem of 21st century London. Now, it's not just mosque attendance, which has risen sharply over the past generation here. Church attendance in London has risen a lot as well. And the people I spoke to were, yes, they were Muslims, many of them, but they were also either Catholics or ex-Catholic converts to charismatic or Pentecostal Christianity. What they all had in common was a faith. I mean, that was what really got them out of bed in the morning. And one of the ironies about our current predicament is that the class of people who are most worried about immigration in this country, namely people of blue-collar backgrounds, white British living in the provinces, in many ways have most in common with these immigrants because they are all social conservatives.
I don't know whether the blue-collar people are social conservatives in that sense. I know what you're saying. I suppose what it is as well, Rupert, is that during this time, let's just take the Church of England. It appears to not even believe in itself anymore. You know, it's been. I know that you've written a biography of Rowan Williams, haven't you? Who was formerly, some time ago, Archbishop of Canterbury. It seems to not to believe in itself. It seems not to really even want to preserve the furniture of its religion. I mean, do you think I'm over egging the pudding there?
Well, you're speaking to a Roman Catholic. I'm in a strange little class of one in being a biographer of both a Pope and an Archbishop.
This is of Pope Benedict.
That's right, yes. And I am alive to, more robust, let's say, or more conservative Catholic arguments that would say only the Catholic Church has the intellectual and the institutional ballast to stand up to the winds of secularism. And laughing at the trendy vicar has long been a trope in our culture, hasn't it, going back generations. I feel torn, Peter, because Rowan Williams is a figure of enormous stature. I was taught by him at university, and I've gone on learning a lot from him throughout my life, and there are some very good theologians in the Anglican Church. But I think you are right to point to institutional difficulties there. And in the course of my book, at one point I do quote an exchange on Twitter between some Anglican clerics, and one figure in particular got herself into a bit of a pickle because she was asked to define what the Christian faith is. And her battle cries were, outreach, radical equality, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, and so forth. And another cleric, herself a renowned feminist theologian, stuck a pin into a rather large bubble at this point by tweeting to say, "It isn't that I disagree with you, but there is not a word that you have uttered that a member of Humanists UK could not agree with. Mm-hmm. What you talk of as the essence of Christianity is at best a consequence, albeit of course a very important consequence, of the absolute fundamental Christian teaching that God was man in Palestine and lives today in bread and wine, to cite John Betjeman. And yes, in a nutshell, I think you are right to imply that a concerning number of clerics need to be reminded that Christianity does purport to rest on a revelation, and religion is a lot more than ethics tinged with emotion, as somebody once put it.
Yes. You've had these, I know they're tabloid fodder, but you've had these kind of stories of discotheques happening in Canterbury Cathedral and all of this. But nevertheless, symbolically, these things are really quite important, it seems to me. See, on the one hand, you have the people in the church seemingly fully embracing identity politics, for example. You mentioned that at the beginning. But also, when I say about the furniture of the religion, I mean the symbolic places of that religion are great churches, which are sort of either closing or turning into mosques or even into commercial use. It seems that the church itself doesn't really seem to care too much about that happening. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I know what you mean, of course. And the sadness for me is that Christianity really does have the resources to take us forward.
Yeah.
I mean, if we take a term like woke, if you had asked me back in the 90s, well, of course, the word woke wasn't in use then. Perhaps a neutral synonym would be being inclusive. Mm. If you'd asked me then, what do you mean by being inclusive? I would have said, well, above all, racism, sexism, and homophobia are bad things, and we should fight against them. The problem, as you know, is that set of principles has morphed into a much more detailed and prescriptive body of teaching, taking in everything from intersectionality to critical race theory to hardline trans activism. And that in turn has led to competitive victimhood without much sense of a sort of negotiated common good, an almost metaphysical obsession with identity. And a neglect of what I would see as a core Christian insight, which is that the boundary between good and evil runs through the human heart, not between this group and that group. So, Galatians 3:16, in Christ, there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, is provides a much deeper philosophical underpinning for belief in the radical equality of all. And I think part of the genius of Christianity is that it can draw, let's say, on the toolboxes of both left and right to take us forward. Of course, that's, I'm not saying that there haven't been mistakes and false starts and what have you in the past, and of course the church has been guilty of homophobia and sexism, but at its best, it does offer a way through that. So I am saying, in essence, I am calling particularly on a cast of opinion formers and intellectuals who I think are a lot more secularized in their outlook than Joe or Josephine Public, a long way from the centers of power and influence. I'm calling on the opinion formers to give Christianity another look.
What do you think the chances are?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't be...
I'm not being... because I was trying to interrupt you there.
Yes.
The reason I ask is that the way it is now, with the kind of identity politics of the church, and I'm talking about the Church of England, and also, for that matter, the support for BLM and all of this, is that essentially... it seems to me that the chances of them actually looking at a creed that they see as being oppressive, this is the problem, is that Christianity to these people is seen as the religion of the oppressive white man. Surely this is one of the reasons why we don't hear about the persecution of Christians all around the world.
Yeah, it's a very good point. People are so ignorant that they associate Christianity with the West, and therefore the wealthy and the privileged. There's no sense that, or no awareness that Christianity, of course, is an export from the Middle East. When Rowan Williams was Archbishop of Canterbury, he told me that he went to meet a senior minister in Gordon Brown's government to raise the subject of persecuted Christians. And the person involved said, well, of course, if these Christians will march into Muslim countries to try to convert them, then what do you expect? And you want to curl up in a ball and cry, because the depth of the ignorance is just phenomenal. These countries, many of them were Christian before they ever became Muslim, and a country like Egypt has a tremendously venerable Christian tradition, and Christianity itself is now a faith of the global South. I mean, the centre of Christianity some time ago moved to Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and I mean, wherever I go, not only in London, but in other parts of the UK, I will meet immigrants from Africa and Latin America who, in the course of my researches, they invited me to their churches. I'm the author of a book called Christianophobia, A Faith Under Attack, which I wrote out of a sense of this enormous elephant in the room. It's frightfully fashionable to be a persecuted something else. It is not fashionable to be a persecuted Christian, even though Christianity is not just the world's most persecuted faith. It's more persecuted than all other faiths put together. But you wouldn't you wouldn't really get that impression from the British media. And to think that in London I have met umpteen Christians of colour who have fled persecution from their native countries.
Oh yes, BBC is particularly bad at not covering this.
Yes,
it just doesn't seem to be. It's just not part. It's not on their pantheon of victimhood. Or rather, it's right at the bottom.
Exactly right. And I could give you so many examples to corroborate that. Let me just cite one off the top of my head. Just over 10 years ago, a Christian woman in Sudan, was forced to give birth in prison while shackled. She was chained up as her baby was born. This story was greeted with outrage, as one might expect. But the line that the BBC took was, how can the British government be sending money to a regime which treats women in this way? Yeah. Well, where do you begin in unpacking that? She was being treated abominably, not because she was a woman, but because she was a Christian woman, number one. And number two, under Sharia, the penalty for a so-called apostate would have been even more harsh.
Well,
I mean, a man would have been condemned to death. And as it happens, I mean, this woman had been raised, she hadn't converted to Christianity. She had been raised a Christian by her Christian mother because her Muslim father had abandoned the family when she was a baby. There is not really a single country now, from Morocco to Pakistan, in which Christians can live entirely without harassment. My book is very definitely not premised on belief in a clash of civilizations. I'm conscious of the damage that Anglo-French colonial adventurism has done in the past. I'm very conscious of all the countries where persecution of Christians comes from the Communist Party, for example, as it does in China and other Far Eastern communist countries. I'm aware that India has become extremely chauvinistic to Muslims as well as to Christians. And, of course, there is some secular intolerance of Christians. Very sadly, there is also, however, Islamist persecution of Christians in Europe. And I just filed a blog to the Spectator magazine on this very subject, actually. And at the moment, we are witnessing an average of 2 attacks per day.
What kind of attacks?
On churches in France.
Right. Well, I was going to ask you about this, because this seems to be one of the great, unreported things that's happening. But a rather large, I don't think it was a cathedral, it was a big church recently, went up. It was the 40th in flames, 40th in 2 years. Are you saying that this is actually Islamist activity?
Yes, a small amount of it comes from the hard left, which also in France makes common cause with hardline Islamists. But most of it, sadly, is coming from, let me stress, the vast majority of Muslims have no truck whatsoever with violent extremism. Although one could hope that more would be done within the Muslim community to silence the extremists, because they are growing in number and the desecrations are extraordinary, really. I mean, we know of the priest murdered at the altar some years ago. You get a lot of defacement of statues of a particularly sinister kind. You get knives being stuck through the throat of statues of the Virgin Mary. You get a great deal of graffiti on the walls of churches with slogans like, submit to Allah or else, or abandon your idolatry. Now, the supreme irony of all this is that classical Islam has always said, first of all, it views Jews and Christians as people of the book, and therefore standing within a close to the centre of a series of concentric circles, with other faiths being like Hinduism being considered to be further out. And also in traditional Islamic jurisprudence, the teaching has always been firmly, if you as a Muslim reside in a non-Muslim society, if it's a society, mainly populated by Christians or adherents of another faith tradition, then you jolly well go along with the mores of the host society.
Yes, until you are in the majority.
Yes.
Until you are in the majority, then everything changes.
Yes.
But that is quite clear. They're quite clear about.
But if I could just finish the point, because I think that this does get overlooked far too much. People say sometimes, oh, Islam is backward and it needs a reformation. I would say no. Islam has been having a reformation in the form of Salafism ever since the 18th century. And the results have been as blood-soaked as the European Reformation. What Islam really needs is a rediscovery of its sophisticated roots. Islam, civilizationally, was ahead of the Christian world for the first half of the Islamic era. It was only really with the Renaissance and the conquest of America that the Christian world really started to bounce back, and then for other reasons, the Muslim world went into decline intellectually and in other respects. But what these Salafists do is to leapfrog many centuries of careful reflection. I think it's Al-Ghazali, the renowned medieval Islamic thinker, who said, Islamic jurisprudence is 1/10 text and 9/10 context. In other words, it's no use either Muslim fundamentalists or their secular opponents saying, but it says this, and this terrible thing in the Quran, because these passages have been viewed differently at different times. I mean, when all is said and done, Peter, Islam is, it is a worldlier religion in the sense that it has a more martial understanding of things. Both faiths are saturated in the language of victory, but whereas in Christianity the emphasis is on, in Islam the emphasis is on victory in the world. In Christianity the emphasis is on victory over the world. Nevertheless, there are plenty of resources within Islam, if properly deployed, to enable a more convivial relationship than we often have now. But they need to be brought out.
Yes, I would say to that for all I know, yes, basically this is a relative minority interpretation of Islam, all the things you just said, but in a way it's irrelevant, it seems to me, because they are not the dynamic, they are not making, progress. It is the other sort of approach to Islam, if you want. One could call it a literal approach to whatever, to the Quran. But that is actually what has got the wind in its sails. That is the dynamic. And you can go on about sort of all the different sort of more moderate interpretations. It doesn't matter.
Yes.
Surely. When you have 40 churches being burned down.
Yes. Yeah, well, that the culprits obviously need to be brought to book over that. I suppose I'm not very hopeful in the near term. All I'm doing really is saying, well, a couple of things. One is that Islamist extremists are unlikely to renounce their beliefs for secular liberal reasons, but they may do for Islamic reasons. And that's why, sadly, I think it's wound up now, but an organisation like the Quilliam Foundation and certain imams I know privately do what I regard as excellent work in prisons to de-radicalise people who've got hold of the very extreme ideas about things. I wouldn't underestimate, Peter, the political element in all this. Sometimes the divisions are not between religions, they're within religions. In a country like Pakistan, you have broadly two forms of Islam, the Barelvi and the Deobandi. The Barelvi are much more laid back, they go on pilgrimage, they have very positive estimates of Christians. The Deobandi remind me a little bit of Calvin's Geneva or the Cromwellians, ultra rigorist. And a little while back, I was listening to an interview on the radio with a young Muslim who, thanks to not so positive influences of the internet, had a rather laid back Muslim upbringing in Leeds. And all of a sudden, he shunned the Barelvi mosque that his family had always attended and went to the Deobandi one and started wagging his finger at his mother for not wearing a headscarf, which his fiancée and his sisters certainly did. But he grew out of it. And I can't help but see, the growth in hardline carnivorous Islam as being connected with 9/11 and the mistakes that were made in the wake of that atrocity. And, different strokes for different folks.
Yes, I suppose that what people always thought would happen has not happened. That basically with each generation there would be a kind of, a smoothing off of the edges. People would sort of fit it. Younger people, on the whole, younger Muslim men, are far more hardline when it comes to all the issues like ones you just raised, headscarves and what have you, being on homosexuality, all of this. But actually, rather worryingly as well, on issues such as Sharia law and on issues such as, depicting the Prophet, for example.
Yes,
things like that.
yes.
These are all things which could be managed under old-fashioned kind of multiculturalism when the demographics weren't like they are. This is why I'm less sanguine about it than maybe you are.
Well, I should perhaps stress that ultimately I want to commend Christianity because I believe that it's true.
Yeah.
As you're aware, there's been a lot of talk of cultural Christianity. At my book launch, I did an event with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who, as many of our viewers will know, was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Then she decided that all religion was bunk, and she became a militant atheist and an ally of Richard Dawkins. And then last Christmas, she announced with a bit of a fanfare that she considered herself to be a cultural Christian because Christianity, in her view, is a bulwark against militant Islam. The situation is evidently dynamic because 3 weeks ago she got baptized and I had the privilege of attending that ceremony. But goodness me, even Richard Dawkins has started saying, well, by that standard I am a a cultural Christian. You know, I enjoy the music of Bach, and I lament a decline in biblical literacy among the young. I can't just see Christianity as a useful falsehood in that way. It is true, in my view, or the closest we're likely to get to the truth in this life, which doesn't exclude an open-handed attitude towards other faiths. But I would certainly agree with you that it also provides some of those intellectual tools for defanging some of the more aggressive forms of, yes, both secularism and Islamism that we face.
Actually, you mentioned Richard Dawkins there and cultural Christian. When we talk about religious issues on this channel, it's always really about, can one just be a cultural Christian? I've had Rod Dreher on a couple of times. Can this be, is it possible? You know, one's actually been called a sort of, you know, a kind of freeloader on real Christianity. You know, I would call myself a cultural Christian. What did you feel, though, when Richard Dawkins said in that interview recently, which got a lot of people hot under the collar, he said, yes, I love church music. The architecture is beautiful, and I don't like the idea that they will be turned into mosques. He was very specific about that. And you look at it and you think, even as someone who is not hugely of faith, you think, you've devoted your life to knocking the hell out of this thing. And now you turn round and actually you quite regret that these things are on the decline.
Yes, I think you really put your finger on something, and the polite response to that would be that Richard Dawkins is torn between different versions of himself. I think it was in 2021, his 80th birthday, and he did a birthday interview on the Today programme. And Nick Robinson, who of course is famously forensic, not to say aggressive on occasion in interview, allowed Dawkins to get away with what struck me as the outrageous claim that, you know, he'd done no more than tweak the tail of Christianity, and that he'd never really been all that fierce. I'm sorry to say that I think he has poisoned the wells of discourse. He's a very gifted scientific popularizer, but his books about Christianity are very bad. And I think if you wanted me to just sum up, because one of my books is called Outgrowing Dawkins and subtitled God for Grown-Ups. It's a reply to Outgrowing God. Yeah. You can only really, two parties can only have a real disagreement if they agree on what it is that they disagree about. And by that yardstick, Dawkins doesn't even get to first base, because the God in which he disbelieves, lowercase g for God, the God in which he disbelieves is a blown-up creature. It's not the God as conceived in classical tradition. God is not, according to these, particularly the three Abrahamic faiths, God is not a great big piece on the chessboard, competing for space with us, competing for elbow room. If you want an analogy, it would be something a little bit more like light, perhaps. You know, you walk into a room, you don't see a table, a chair, and some light. It's by dint of light that you see anything at all. You can't see your own eye, but it's your eye that grounds your vision of everything else. If you ask, I don't know, where is Shakespeare in Hamlet, or Tolstoy in War and Peace? The answer, of course, is everywhere and nowhere.
Yes.
I mean, the author inhabits every every line of the narrative, but is himself or herself invisible. And what Dawkins has done again and again is to take a very soft target, let's say a fundamentalist from the deep south,
yes,
who's opposed to the teaching of evolution in schools, if you had more integrity, I think, somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas, when he's arguing a point, he always begins by stating the most potent form of the argument that he's going to end up refuting. So he states it in as forceful a way as he can, and then only at that point does he turn around and say, but plausible though that view is, I think it's mistaken for A, B, and C reasons. Richard Dawkins parachuted into religious territory without map or compass, and he was a sort of trailblazer for another set of figures like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett. Interestingly, there are schisms among the godless party, the anti-religion party, as well as within churches and other faith groups, because you now have somebody like Sarah Harris talking much more positively about spirituality. I mean, if you wanted me to sound a positive note, which I think does have some basis to it, I think there is a generation now who've never viewed Christianity as something to kick against, because they never had it rammed down their throats in the first place. And I've got younger friends in their 30s who are teaching teenagers and 20-somethings who are more open than you might think, and who are embracing, it's interesting, the sort of more full-fat forms of religion. It's perhaps Latin Mass Catholicism, or maybe it's Pentecostalism,
or Eastern Orthodox,
or indeed Eastern Orthodoxy, and all these traditions in the UK are growing at the moment. And I mean, what you say about the BBC, I am in violent agreement with, because I think that the people who run our broadcasting corporations and newspapers, many of them live in pretty secular bubbles. You've only got to go out to zones 4, 5, or 6 and find, very often that the churches are packed. I remember when I went to Leytonstone, so within about a couple of miles of the Olympic Stadium, I realised pretty fast, I was there one Sunday, I saw that if I imagined that the centre of spiritual life was in the local Anglican or Catholic church, I was very mistaken. I needed to go to the business park on the edge of the neighbourhood, where I found not 1 or 2, but 3 enormously thriving Pentecostal congregations. And, I was one of the very few white people present at that worship.
Yes. I completely understand. I have no data about it, but I just know in people in my, who swim in these waters around here, Westminster, who are between 20 and 30, and definitely looking at this whole thing again. And as you said, full fat, none of you are kind of, sort of happy clappy. I mean, they want the whole thing, Rupert, thank you very much anyway for coming and talking to us about it. The book is The Eclipse of Christianity and Why It Matters. Obviously, it's in bookshops, is it, as well as Amazon? Great. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
It's great to hear. It's Rupert Shortt, and we shall be back with you next week. Goodbye.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.